The macabre history of the Fields, a millionaire woman locked 8 children in a crumbling estate. The spring of 2022 brought with it a discovery that would send shockwaves through the quiet agricultural community of Millerville, Ohio, and expose one of the most harrowing cases of child imprisonment and systematic abuse in modern American history. Fire Marshal David Chun had been dispatched to investigate reports of smoke billowing from the abandoned Fieldstone Manor, a once grand estate that had been slowly crumbling on the outskirts of town for over 2 decades, when he made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his career. What Chun found when he forced entry into the smoke-filled mansion was not the simple structural fire he had expected, but evidence of habitation in a building that county records indicated had been vacant since 1998. More disturbing still were the sounds coming from the upper floors, the unmistakable voices of children calling for help, trapped somewhere within the mansion's labyrinthine interior. The estate belonged to the Field family, once among Ohio's wealthiest landowners, whose fortune had been built on agricultural investments and land speculation during the early 20th century. The mansion itself was a testament to Gilded Age excess, with over 40 rooms spread across 3 floors, surrounded by thousands of acres of farmland that had once made the Fields one of the most powerful families in the region. But the grandeur that Chun discovered as he fought his way through smoke and debris was overshadowed by evidence of systematic neglect and deliberate deterioration. The mansion's roof leaked in dozens of places, wallpaper hung in rotting strips from water-damaged walls, and many rooms had been sealed shut with heavy boards and multiple locks. The entire structure felt more like a prison than a home, with modifications that suggested someone had been systematically restricting access to different areas of the building. Following the sounds of the trapped children, Chun made his way to the mansion's 3rd floor, where he discovered 8 individuals, ranging in age from 10 to 26, locked behind a series of reinforced doors in what had once been the estate's servant quarters. The children, for that was how they appeared, despite some being technically adults, were emaciated, pale, and bore the unmistakable signs of long-term confinement and systematic abuse. The woman responsible for their imprisonment was found collapsed in the mansion's library, overcome by smoke inhalation, but still clutching a ring of keys that unlocked the various doors and barriers she had installed throughout the building. She identified herself as Vivian Field, the last surviving member of the family dynasty, and claimed that she had been protecting the children from dangers they couldn't understand while providing them with the care and education they needed to survive in a hostile world. But investigation into Vivian's background and the conditions within the mansion revealed a reality far more disturbing than her claims of protective custody. The 8 individuals she had imprisoned appeared to have been living in deliberately maintained squalor, confined to a small section of the 3rd floor with minimal food, no medical care, and educational materials that consisted primarily of religious texts and handwritten lessons that emphasized obedience, suffering, and the necessity of accepting their confined existence as God's will. The physical evidence told a story of systematic cruelty and psychological manipulation that had been conducted over a period of at least 15 years. The children's living quarters were cramped, unsanitary, and deliberately uncomfortable, with sleeping arrangements that provided minimal privacy or comfort. The meals they received were nutritionally inadequate and had been rationed to maintain them in a state of chronic hunger that made them dependent on Vivian's daily provision of food. But perhaps most disturbing was the evidence of psychological conditioning that had convinced the children that their imprisonment was both necessary and deserved. They had been taught that the outside world was too dangerous for them to survive, that they possessed characteristics or backgrounds that made them unsuitable for normal society, and that Vivian's confinement of them was an act of mercy that protected them from fates far worse than their current circumstances. Dr. Patricia Williams, a child psychologist, rushed to the scene to assess the victim's mental state. found evidence of psychological trauma so severe that several of the children initially refused to leave the mansion even when offered freedom. They had been so thoroughly conditioned to fear the outside world and depend on Vivian's authority that the prospect of liberation caused them panic and anxiety rather than relief. Investigation into the children's backgrounds revealed that they had been acquired by Vivian through a variety of means over a 15-year period, beginning around 2007 when her inheritance of the family fortune had provided her with the resources to begin what she called her salvation project. The children came from foster care systems, international adoption agencies, and humanitarian organizations, all carefully selected based on criteria that made them unlikely to be missed if they disappeared from official oversight. Vivian had specifically targeted children who were orphaned, displaced, or from troubled backgrounds, convincing social service agencies and adoption organizations that she could provide them with stability, education, and opportunities that wouldn't be available through conventional placement. Her wealth and social position had allowed her to bypass normal oversight procedures while maintaining the appearance of conducting legitimate charitable work. But investigation into the mansion's history revealed that Vivian's treatment of the children represented the culmination of psychological deterioration that had been developing for decades. Financial records showed that she had inherited the Field fortune in 1998, following the deaths of her parents. But rather than maintaining the family's agricultural enterprises, she had systematically liquidated assets and withdrawn from all social contact. The mansion itself had been allowed to deteriorate deliberately, with Vivian refusing to maintain the heating, plumbing, or structural integrity of the building while continuing to live within its decaying walls. She had gradually sealed off sections of the house, creating a smaller and smaller living space that she could control absolutely, while the remainder of the structure fell into ruins around her. Local residents reported that Vivian had become increasingly reclusive and paranoid throughout the early 2000s, making infrequent trips to town for supplies, but avoiding all social contact and responding to expressions of concern with hostility and threats of legal action. The gradual deterioration of the mansion had been visible from the road, but Vivian's wealth and legal threats had discouraged official investigation into her welfare or the condition of her property. The financial investigation revealed that Vivian had been funding her isolation and the imprisonment of the children through systematic liquidation of the Field family assets, selling land investments and valuable property to generate the cash necessary to maintain her operation, while avoiding the kind of financial transactions that might trigger outside oversight. But perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that Vivian's treatment of the children had become increasingly severe over time as her mental state deteriorated and her paranoia intensified. The earlier victims had been subjected to confinement and psychological manipulation, but the children acquired in recent years had experienced systematic starvation, medical neglect, and psychological torture that suggested Vivian's capacity for rational thought had been gradually overwhelmed by delusions and compulsions. The children themselves, when finally interviewed by trained professionals, revealed the full scope of the psychological conditioning they had endured. They had been taught that they were inherently flawed individuals who could only achieve redemption through suffering and absolute obedience to Vivian's authority. They believed that their confinement was punishment for sins they had committed in previous lives or characteristics they possessed that made them dangerous to normal society. Vivian had convinced them that the outside world was filled with people who would exploit, abuse, or kill them if they were discovered, and that her mansion was the only place where they could be safe from the violence and corruption that characterized modern civilization. She had used their isolation and dependence to create a belief system that made them grateful for their imprisonment while terrified of the freedom that others might offer them. Medical examination of the children revealed the physical toll of their confinement and abuse. They suffered from malnutrition, untreated medical conditions, and developmental delays that reflected years of deliberate neglect and inadequate care. Several had injuries that suggested physical punishment, and all showed signs of the stress-related health problems that result from chronic fear and psychological trauma. But perhaps most heartbreaking was their complete lack of understanding about normal human relationships, social interaction, or the basic rights and freedoms that characterize life in modern society. They had been so thoroughly isolated from normal human contact that they possessed no frame of reference for understanding the difference between care and abuse, protection and imprisonment, love and control. As authorities attempted to understand the scope of Vivian's crimes and the extent of the children's trauma, they realized they were confronting a case that challenged every assumption about the relationship between wealth and accountability, privacy and oversight, and the ability of individuals to hide systematic abuse behind facades of charitable intent and family legacy. The crumbling mansion that had housed this horror was a physical manifestation of the moral and psychological decay that had consumed Vivian Field and destroyed the lives of 8 innocent children who had been trapped within its walls for years. While a community remained, the comprehensive investigation that followed the discovery of Vivian Field's House of Horrors would reveal a psychological descent into madness that had transformed the wealthy heiress into one of the most sadistic child abusers in modern American history, while exposing how isolation, untreated mental illness, and unlimited financial resources could create conditions for systematic torture that operated beyond the reach of social oversight for decades. FBI Special Agent Sarah Martinez, who assumed control of the federal investigation in April 2022, discovered that Vivian Field's transformation from respected community member to child captor had been gradual and systematic, driven by a combination of inherited mental illness, social isolation, and traumatic experiences that had shattered her connection to normal human empathy and moral reasoning. The investigation revealed that Vivian had been born in 1965 into a family with a long history of mental illness that had been carefully hidden behind wealth and social position. The Field family had produced several generations of individuals who suffered from various psychiatric disorders, but their financial resources had allowed them to avoid public scrutiny while managing their conditions through private care and social isolation. Dr. Margaret Chun, a forensic psychiatrist brought in to analyze Vivian's mental state and the psychological methods she had used to control her victims, discovered extensive documentation that revealed the development of what could only be described as a systematic torture program designed to break the children's will while maintaining their physical survival. Vivian's personal papers, found throughout the mansion, chronicled her gradual development of theories about human nature, suffering, and redemption that had evolved into a complex delusional system that justified her treatment of the children as necessary spiritual education. She had convinced herself that the children she imprisoned were inherently corrupted souls who could only achieve salvation through the suffering and purification that she provided. The documentation revealed that Vivian's psychological deterioration had accelerated following her parents' deaths in 1998, when she had inherited not only enormous wealth, but also the burden of maintaining the family's reputation while dealing with her own untreated psychiatric conditions. The isolation she had chosen as a coping mechanism had gradually transformed into paranoid delusions about the outside world and her role as a protector of innocent children from its corrupting influences. But investigation into the specific methods Vivian had used to acquire and control the children revealed a level of sophistication and planning that suggested periods of rational calculation between episodes of delusional thinking. She had systematically researched child psychology, institutional management, and behavioral modification techniques, using her findings to develop increasingly effective methods for breaking down the children's resistance and ensuring their compliance. The children had been subjected to what Dr. Chun identified as a combination of sensory deprivation, intermittent reinforcement, and systematic humiliation designed to destroy their sense of individual worth while creating complete psychological dependence on Vivian's approval and care. They had been kept in states of chronic hunger, cold, and fear, while being taught that their suffering was both deserved and necessary for their spiritual development. Agent Martinez's investigation revealed that Vivian had been documenting her treatment of the children through detailed journals and photographic records that she apparently intended to use as evidence for the effectiveness of her rehabilitation methods. These documents provided disturbing insights into her psychological state and the document's evolution of her treatment methods from simple confinement to systematic torture. The financial investigation showed that Vivian had been funding her operation through careful liquidation of family assets while maintaining enough wealth to continue her activities indefinitely. She had sold off thousands of acres of farmland, valuable art collections, and investment portfolios, converting everything into cash and precious metals that allowed her to operate without creating financial records that might trigger outside investigation. But perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that Vivian's treatment of the children had been designed not just to control them, but to study their responses to various forms of psychological and physical stress. She had been conducting what amounted to unauthorized human experimentation, testing theories about pain tolerance, psychological resilience, and the relationship between suffering and spiritual development. The investigation also revealed that several of the children had died under Vivian's care over the years, their bodies buried in unmarked graves throughout the estate's extensive grounds. Ground-penetrating radar revealed at least 6 burial sites, suggesting that Vivian's experimentation had claimed multiple victims, whose deaths she had concealed while continuing to acquire new subjects for her studies. Dr. Chun's analysis of Vivian's psychological condition revealed a complex combination of narcissistic personality disorder, paranoid delusions, and sadistic tendencies that had been exacerbated by decades of social isolation and unlimited access to vulnerable victims. Vivian had gradually lost all capacity for normal human empathy while developing an elaborate rationalization system that allowed her to view systematic torture as charitable work. The children who survived Vivian's imprisonment presented unprecedented challenges for medical and psychological rehabilitation. They had been so thoroughly conditioned to accept abuse as normal that they initially resisted efforts to provide them with proper care and treatment. Their understanding of human relationships had been so distorted that they viewed kindness with suspicion and interpreted basic medical care as potential threats. Most heartbreaking was their complete internalization of Vivian's belief system about their own worthlessness and the necessity of their suffering. They genuinely believed that they deserved the treatment they had received, and that attempts to help them were misguided interference with their spiritual development. The psychological conditioning had been so complete that several of the children requested to be returned to Vivian's care even after learning about the availability of freedom and proper medical attention. The investigation revealed that Vivian's operation had continued for so long partly because of the community's willingness to respect the privacy of wealthy families while avoiding the kind of intrusive oversight that might have revealed the truth about conditions within the mansion. Local authorities had received occasional reports about strange noises or unusual activity at the estate, but Vivian's social position and legal threats had discouraged investigation. The case also exposed significant gaps in oversight of private adoption and child placement services that had allowed Vivian to acquire children without triggering the kind of follow-up supervision that might have revealed their fate. Her wealth and apparent respectability had provided her with access to vulnerable children while shielding her from the scrutiny that less privileged individuals would have faced. Vivian Field herself, when subjected to comprehensive psychiatric evaluation, was found to be suffering from multiple severe mental disorders that had rendered her incapable of understanding the harm she had caused to her victims. She continued to defend her treatment of the children as necessary education and expressed genuine confusion about why others viewed her actions as harmful rather than beneficial. Dr. Chun's final assessment concluded that Vivian represented a unique case study in how untreated mental illness combined with social isolation and unlimited resources could create conditions for systematic child abuse that exceeded anything documented in the professional literature. Her descent into madness had been gradual and systematic, but the ultimate result had been the creation of a private hell that had consumed multiple young lives. While remaining hidden from public view for decades, the surviving children were placed in specialized residential facilities designed to address the complex trauma they had experienced, while gradually introducing them to concepts of normal human relationships and basic rights. Some showed remarkable resilience and began developing healthy attachments and life skills, while others remained psychologically committed to the belief systems that Vivian had instilled during their years of captivity. The macabre history of the Fields revealed that some of the most devastating forms of child abuse could be perpetrated by individuals who possessed the financial resources to operate beyond normal social oversight while suffering from mental conditions that eliminated their capacity for normal human empathy. Vivian's wealth had allowed her to create a private kingdom where her delusions could be implemented without interference, resulting in suffering that exceeded anything that most people could imagine or believe possible. The case led to significant reforms in oversight of private residential arrangements and adoption services, but it also raised fundamental questions about the relationship between wealth and accountability that continue to influence discussions about child protection and social responsibility. The children who survived Vivian's house of horrors serve as living reminders that the greatest threats to vulnerable youth might come not from obvious criminals but from individuals whose mental illness and social position allow them to conduct systematic abuse while maintaining facades of respectability and charitable intent. Their ongoing recovery serves as evidence that human resilience can overcome even the most severe trauma, but also as a warning that the protection of children requires vigilance against those who would use their resources and position to create private worlds where their darkest impulses can be implemented without constraint or consequence. Thank you for watching another tale unfold here on NW Storytime. Every story hides a secret, and tonight you uncovered another one. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It helps us keep the secrets alive. Until next time, stay curious.